Montel Williams. What if the man millions of people trusted with their darkest secrets was quietly fighting a war nobody in the audience ever saw? For 17 years, he sat across from strangers and got them to say the things they were terrified to say out loud. Grieving mothers, struggling veterans, kids nobody else wanted to listen to. He held space for all of it, night after night, in front of 20 million households in 170 countries. And the entire time, underneath the suit and the studio lights, his own body was turning against him. His marriages were falling apart, and the fortune he built dollar by dollar was slipping through his fingers. This is the real story of Montel Williams, and if you've ever needed someone to simply listen without judging you, stick around, because his story might hit closer to home than you expect. Let's start at the beginning, because nothing about this man's rise makes sense unless you understand where he came from. He was born on July 3, 1956, in Baltimore, Maryland, a city that doesn't hand anything to anybody. His dad, Herman Williams, wasn't the warm, hug-you-every-morning type. Herman was a Baltimore firefighter who eventually rose all the way to fire chief, and he ran his household the same way he ran his crew. High standards, no excuses, and very little room for softness. In that house, doing well wasn't praised. It was expected. Falling short wasn't a small thing you brushed off. It was a conversation, and those conversations weren't gentle. His mom balanced things out, at least a little. She was the quiet, steady presence who showed up in the moments after his father's discipline had already done its work, when a kid just needed somebody to sit with him. But even her warmth couldn't fully cancel out the pressure hanging over that house, like a permanent weather system. Montel was the second of 4 kids, and from early on, he understood something most children don't have to figure out so young. His place in that family depended on results. Not in some dramatic, theatrical way, just in the everyday grind of getting up before doubt could talk him out of anything. School wasn't some escape from all that pressure. It was just another place to prove himself. He wasn't the smartest kid in the room. He was the kid who simply refused to quit. And by the time he hit his teenage years, that refusal had turned into something close to an obsession. This constant, nagging need to prove he was enough. Every kid raised under that kind of weight knows that voice. It doesn't go away. It just starts speaking a new language. Rank, ratings, revenue, recognition. High school is also where he found the thing that would define the next 20 years of his life. The military. He went to the Naval Academy Preparatory School, then earned his way into the United States Naval Academy in Annapolis. Nobody handed him that spot. He wasn't the most naturally gifted cadet walking through those gates, but he outworked almost everybody around him, pushing through the physical grind, the academics, and the very real fact that he was one of the only black cadets navigating an institution that wasn't exactly built with him in mind. He graduated in 1980 with an engineering degree and a commission, first in the Marine Corps, then later the Navy, where he'd stay for 22 years total, working as a certified cryptologist and breaking barriers most people never even hear about. But before any medals, before any cameras, he was just a serious, watchful kid from Baltimore, already carrying the kind of resilience that no amount of pressure had managed to break. It hadn't crushed him, it had built him. Now here's where the story takes a hard turn, because going from a decorated naval officer to a national television host isn't exactly a natural career move. It's basically leaping from one universe into a completely different one. In 1989, while he was still in uniform, Montel started speaking publicly about drug prevention and at-risk kids. Not because some PR team told him it would look good, because he genuinely couldn't stand watching young lives get wasted before they'd even started. He was invited to speak at schools, community centers, military bases, and people noticed something rare in him. A guy with the bearing of a military officer who somehow spoke with total emotional honesty. Word spread. In 1991, a television producer caught one of his talks and reportedly turned to a colleague and said something like, "This guy isn't performing sincerity, he actually has it." Within months, that turned into meetings, then a pilot, And by the fall of 1991, the Montel Williams show launched nationally. And it hit different. Daytime TV back then was full of shouting matches and manufactured drama. And here comes this guy who actually listens, who challenges people without tearing them down, who puts veterans, struggling families, and forgotten kids front and center instead of turning their pain into a punchline. He said it best himself once. He wasn't trying to be a talk show host. He was trying to finish conversations nobody else would even start. That honesty paid off. By the mid-90s, the show had already snagged a Daytime Emmy, which genuinely stunned an industry that wasn't sure whether to take him seriously. More nominations followed. But he later admitted that success didn't exactly bring peace. If anything, it cranked the pressure up. A bigger stage, he said, just means more people watching if you fall. That's the residue of a childhood spent trying to earn approval from a father who rarely gave it easily. He was 35, he'd already served his country for nearly a decade, and now he had the biggest platform he could have imagined. The only question left was what it would cost him to keep it. And what came next was basically a decade-long masterclass in what happens when discipline and ambition get handed a national stage and told to run wild. Ratings kept climbing through the 90s. At its peak, the show was reaching roughly 20 million households across 170 countries, putting him right at the top of daytime television, not just in the conversation. 17 straight seasons. 17 years of pulling stories out of people that the rest of the industry was happy to ignore. Veterans coming home with wounds nobody had taught the public to recognize. Families wrecked by addiction with no words to describe it. Kids swallowed whole by a justice system that was never built for them. He picked up the Daytime Emmy for Outstanding Talk Show Host, built a production company called Montel Media, and launched a motivational speaking career that took him into boardrooms, military bases, and college auditoriums across the country. He testified before Congress about veterans' health care. He lobbied for legislation. He used his fame the way very few celebrities actually do, not to buy comfort for himself, but to get into rooms where decisions were being made about people who had no one else speaking for them. His bank account matched his rising star. By the late 90s, he was sitting on tens of millions of dollars from production deals, speaking fees, and TV contracts. He had a serious apartment in New York City and a second home out in Los Angeles. It looked, from the outside, like something permanent, and every single morning, no matter how packed his schedule was, he was up before the sun doing his workout. Not for fun, but because it was a habit drilled into him at the Naval Academy, something almost sacred. That discipline would end up mattering more than he could have possibly known. Because underneath all of it, the ratings, the awards, the congressional testimony, something else was quietly building, and it wasn't going to stay quiet for much longer. There's a specific kind of damage that fame does to the people standing closest to the famous person. Not the celebrity themselves, since at least they chose that spotlight, but the people sharing a home with somebody whose time and attention are constantly being pulled in 12 directions at once. Montel was married 3 times, and that number isn't really a story about moral failure. It's a story about a man whose internal drive moved way faster than an ordinary marriage could keep up with. His first marriage was to Rochelle C., back in 1982, while he was still in active naval service. They had 2 daughters, Ashley and Marissa, but his career was accelerating faster than his home life could absorb, and the marriage ended in 1989. His second marriage was to Grace Morley, from 1992 to 2000, right as the show was exploding in popularity. They had 2 kids together, a son, Montel Jr., and a daughter, Winter Grace. The show kept growing, the schedule kept expanding, and the man who used to operate under the fixed, predictable structure of military life was now living at the mercy of ratings, network demands, and the strange loneliness of being needed by millions of strangers, while barely being known by the people closest to him. He later admitted, with the kind of honesty that took him years to arrive at, that he gave everything to that platform, and the people nearest to him paid the price for it. That's not something he's proud of. It's something he still carries. It wasn't cruelty that broke those marriages apart. It was absence. The quieter, sneakier kind of abandonment. Not one big betrayal, but 1,000 small evenings where work came first, and the silence at the dinner table said everything nobody wanted to say out loud. By 2007, he married Tara Fowler, a former flight attendant, in a small beach ceremony in Bermuda. That marriage landed at a very different point in his life, after he'd already been living with a diagnosis that would completely rewrite the rest of his story. Because in 1999, at 43 years old, right at the absolute peak of his career, Montel's body started sending him signals he couldn't ignore anymore. Numbness in his hands, a burning sensation running down his legs that no amount of rest or exercise could shake. Pins and needles with no obvious cause and no predictable pattern. This was a man trained by 2 decades of military discipline to push through pain without complaint. But this wasn't fatigue. This was his nervous system trying to tell him something his body didn't have the vocabulary for yet. After months of tests and private dread, the diagnosis finally landed: multiple sclerosis. A disease where your own immune system starts attacking the protective coating around your nerves, scrambling, and sometimes permanently cutting off communication between your brain and the rest of your body. And here's the cruel irony of it all. The same iron discipline that carried him through the Naval Academy, through 22 years of service, through 17 seasons of grueling daily television, was now the exact thing his own biology was targeting. MS doesn't care how strong you are. It doesn't negotiate with determined people. It just moves forward on its own timeline, completely indifferent to what you've built or survived. He later said that sitting in that doctor's office, he thought about every single guest who had ever sat across from him and told him their whole world had just flipped upside down. And for the first time, he understood exactly what that felt like from the inside. There was no single dramatic collapse. It was quieter than that, and honestly scarier. The slow realization that the body he'd trusted completely, the one he'd pushed through every physical limit imaginable, wasn't fully his to command anymore. He went public with the diagnosis on his own show in 1999, standing in front of his own audience instead of hiding behind a carefully worded press release. That took real guts, especially for a man shaped by 22 years in a culture where showing vulnerability wasn't just discouraged, it basically wasn't allowed. The toll piled up over the years. His legs, the same legs that had carried him through military drills and active duty, became the main battleground, with MS attacking the nerves that controlled sensation and movement from the waist down. He described the pain as feeling like walking barefoot across hot coals, all day, every day, with no breaks. His hands developed tremors and numbness, turning simple things like writing or holding a coffee cup into small daily battles. His sleep, already wrecked by the demands of a non-stop production schedule, got worse. MS brings a specific kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep actually fixes. It sits there every morning like a tax you have to pay before the day even starts. And underneath the physical stuff was something even heavier: the uncertainty. MS doesn't give you a timeline. It doesn't tell you what's coming next. It just exists, flaring up or backing off whenever it feels like it, leaving the person living with it in this constant negotiation with the unknown. The man who used to tell everybody else how to get through hard things now had to figure out how to survive one himself. But here's the thing about rebuilding. It's rarely about getting back what you lost. Some things just can't be restored. A marriage, a decade of physical certainty, the quiet confidence of a body that simply does what you tell it. Those things get replaced by something else instead, and if you're honest enough to let it in, sometimes what replaces it ends up being more solid than what came before. For Montel, his kids became the first real anchor. Ashley, Marissa, Montel Jr., and Wintergrace all represented something the disease could threaten, but never actually take away. He admitted once that when he thought about everything MS could steal from him, his mind never went to the show or the career. It went straight to his kids, and the fear of not being around for them. That was the one thing that genuinely scared him. So the guy who once gave every ounce of himself to a television platform started giving something different. His actual presence, to the people who never asked for a spotlight. just for him. In 2002, he launched the Montel Williams MS Foundation, pouring his public profile into research funding and patient support, instead of letting the disease stay wrapped in silence, especially in communities that couldn't afford to suffer quietly. He raised millions. He testified before Congress again, except this time with a different kind of authority. Not speaking about somebody else's struggle, but his own. He refused to whisper about it, because in his words, whispering is exactly how things stay broken. That instinct traces all the way back to the kid from Baltimore, who compensated for uncertainty by never slowing down. The naval officer who spent 2 decades serving something bigger than himself found a brand new mission, one that didn't require physical toughness so much as the much harder, rarer courage of total honesty in public. His relationship with his kids deepened in ways his packed show schedule never used to allow. Bike rides doubled as physical therapy, disguised as quality time. Conversations that would have gotten crowded out during the show's peak years finally had room to happen, simply because he'd been forced, not by choice, but by necessity, to slow down enough to actually be present in his own life. Today, he's in his late 60s, and the disease hasn't gone anywhere. It hasn't offered him a truce. It just keeps moving at its own pace, completely unbothered by everything he's built or fought for. And every single morning, he still meets it the same way he's always met everything, with forward motion, deliberate, disciplined, entirely his own. His net worth today sits somewhere around $15 million, nowhere close to the peak of his talk show years, in part because of what it costs to manage a chronic illness and run a foundation with real reach, and in part because he simply chose to live generously instead of guardedly. He still keeps a home in New York, the city that watched him rise, watched him stumble, and watched him refuse, stubbornly, to stay down. His foundation has raised millions for MS research and patient advocacy since it launched, and he remains one of the most recognized and trusted voices in that entire community. Not because he wanted the job, but because he was honest early enough to end up with it. He's stayed active in veterans advocacy too, showing up before Congress more than once to push for better military health care, because he refuses to let the system quietly forget the people who served. He still talks openly about managing his health, the pain, the workouts, the constant balancing act of a body that no longer follows his orders, with the same bluntness that's defined him his whole life, because somewhere along the way, he decided that honesty always costs less than hiding. So here's what Montel Williams' story really comes down to. It's not the 17 seasons, it's not the Emmy, or the 22 years in uniform, or even the foundation carrying his name into a future he might not get to see fully play out. His real legacy is permission. Permission for every veteran too proud to ask for help. Every patient too scared to say the diagnosis out loud. Every person sitting in a doctor's office, hearing news that feels like the end of everything. Permission to be broken, and still be standing at the exact same time. If this story meant something to you, drop a comment telling me which part hit hardest. And if you want more stories like this, real people, real struggles, real strength, hit subscribe, because the best stories never end without a few scars.